Some people live in a country once called the United States of America. I mean, it still is, but back then, it almost wasn't. The nation has a story to tell. In 1861, America wasn't so peaceful. It split into two sides and fought a war with itself. It was like a family having a huge fight, but with guns and cannons. Why? Well, it started because of one big question. Who gets to be a free human? Let's go back a little. In 1776, America's founders started the nation with big ideas: life, freedom, and happiness. By the early 1800s, northern states were building factories and cities with machines. That's why they wanted people to be free, to choose what job they worked and get paid for that work. However, the South had big farms called plantations. The owners of these plantations were also owners of slave people. Owners shipped these slaves over from Africa and forced them to work on plantations for free, and if they didn't listen, their owners would punish them by whipping. Still, the North and South argued about this for years. As America expanded, its leaders faced a choice. Would new states allow slavery or ban it? Every time a new state joined America, it caused a lot of arguments, but nothing violent. However, the people in the government actually had good intentions in solving the arguments. So in 1820, they made the Missouri Compromise, and later in 1850, they came up with the Compromise of 1850. Both of these laws were meant to ease tensions over slavery, but they didn't actually solve the real problem because they still allowed people to be kept as slaves. Then in 1860, the people elected Republican President Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln didn't promise to end slavery immediately. He mainly wanted to keep the country together and somehow solve the issues of slavery over time. But many people in the South didn't trust him. They were afraid he would try to end slavery for good, which they didn't want to happen because by now their entire economy depended on slaves. But he still got a lot of votes, mainly from the fact that the North had a larger population than the South. So, with more people on one side, more people voted to make him the president. Seeing this as unfair, by February 1861, the southern states like Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas all said, "We quit." And one by one, they left. Now, it temporarily became the divided states of America, and then the southern states did something no one expected. They made their own country, calling themselves the Confederate States of America, or the Confederacy for short. At first, things were tense, but still mostly just angry words. The South said, "We already asked nicely, and you didn't listen, so now we want independence." But the North, which we'll start calling the Union, really didn't want the South to be an independent country called the Confederacy, because it would mean America as a whole would be smaller. So things started to get worse, more than just angry words. The Confederates, using violence, took over some forts and government buildings that used to belong to the Union. Since a government takeover had just happened, both sides started to feel a war might take place, so they began to build their armies. Finally, a breaking point came. There was this fort called Fort Sumter in South Carolina, which was one of the Confederate states. But Fort Sumter still had Union soldiers in it, and the Confederates saw that as a problem. They told the Union troops to leave, but the Union refused. Then President Lincoln decided to send ships with food and water to the fort. But the Confederates didn't see it as just sending supplies to keep the soldiers alive. To them, this looked like the Union was feeding the soldiers to give them energy for a battle. Inside the fort, they thought the Union was preparing to invade the rest of South Carolina, and they believed the Union would use Fort Sumter as its main military base. So before the Lincoln ship's supply could get there, Confederate soldiers said, "Enough is enough. We can't let this happen. Attack them." And just like that, in April 1861, the Confederates fired the first shots at Fort Sumter. Inside the fort, Union soldiers led by Major Robert Anderson did their best to defend against themselves, but after 34 hours of intense cannon fire, they had no choice but to surrender. Even though the war kinda already started years before it, this incident is what historians call the official start of the Civil War. Once the Confederate forces took over Fort Sumter, the Union realized that the Confederates weren't joking. They truly wanted the separation to be permanent. But now the Union had an excuse to make the war not just about keeping the country together, but also forcing the Confederacy to free their slaves. In response, President Lincoln assembled 75,000 volunteers to help stop what he called a rebellion. The Confederacy believed that their way of life, which basically depended on slavery to support their agricultural economy, would not survive if the Union kept trying to end it. As the news spread, more southern states followed South Carolina's lead and prepared for war. Now, without a leader, the Confederate states came together and said, now who's gonna lead us? No one came forward until this guy named Jefferson Davis stepped forward. Davis strongly believed in individual state rights and keeping slavery, which were key to the South's cause. He also served in the US Army during the Mexican-American War before becoming a Mississippi senator, where he showed good leadership. So on February 18th, 1861, the Confederates said, we'll elect him. And they immediately inaugurated Davis, officially making him the president of the Confederacy. Meanwhile, a month later, the Union finally inaugurated Lincoln, even after the voters had elected him months earlier. His first inaugural address, which is basically a speech the president gives after officially becoming president, made it clear that slavery, though a problem, was only a minor problem and not his first focus. However, this wasn't enough to gain back the trust of the Confederates, as they ended up saying, "This guy seems fake. Don't trust him." This lack of trust grew daily, fueling the tension more and more. Eventually, the first real battle, in which both sides prepared to fight without surprise attacks, happened on July 21st, 1861, near a small river called Bull Run, near the town of Manassas, just outside Washington, D.C. General Irvin McDowell led the Union Army, believing that this one big battle would quickly squash the smaller Confederates. But the Confederates, led by General Pierre Beauregard and the famous General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, said, "Well, not on our watch." They literally had no intention of losing quickly. As the battle went on, it became very messy and bloody. Ultimately, the Union Army had to back off in confusion and panic. While the victory at Bull Run lifted the spirits of the Confederates, it was a harsh wake-up call for the Union, which showed how unprepared they were for a conflict of this scale. While the war continued, politics in the North and South were just as intense as the fighting on the battlefield. In the North, President Lincoln faced many challenges. A powerful group in his party called the Radical Republicans wanted to end slavery right away and give full civil rights to African Americans. But many other people, especially in the border states, feared that pushing too hard on slavery could make some people who were kinda unsure about slavery decide that they want to keep slavery. So they ignored the radicals and focused on winning the war first. Meanwhile, in the South, President Davis faced his own challenges. Although he was a skilled military leader, Davis led a nation with a weak government. The Confederate States had just left the Union and focused on keeping their individual state powers. They didn't want a strong central government controlling them, so many Confederate states often disagreed with the central government on important decisions like building an army, collecting supplies, and managing the economy. This made it extremely difficult for Davis to organize a united war effort, but he was eventually able to organize an army. On September 22nd, 1862, they fought the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest single-day battle in American history, where over 23,000 soldiers were killed or wounded. 12 hours later, Lincoln issued a document called the Emancipation Proclamation, which would officially declare all enslaved people in Confederate states free, taking effect on January 1st, 1863. The special thing about the Emancipation Proclamation was that it only affected Confederate states that were in rebellion, not slave states that were still under Union control. This meant that he would keep states who said, "We want slaves, but we also want to stay in the Union," happy. The other thing that was so special about the Emancipation Proclamation was that it prevented both Britain and France from intervening. Both of these countries had been supporting the Confederates indirectly, and Britain heavily relied on the cotton produced by the South, so supporting the Confederates was the best decision for their own interest. The British government had even tried to help them with armed weapons, but Britain and France had also banned slavery in their countries a few years earlier, and supporting a side that wanted to keep slavery would be a bad look on them. So they ended up saying, "We don't want to be involved in any drama. Leave us alone now." Not only that, as this proclamation spoke out against slavery, it gave slaves, now called African Americans, the opportunity to join the Union Army. As a result, more than 180,000 African American people openly joined the war in support of the Union. Now, fast forward to July 1863. Two major events occurred that marked the turning point of the war. First was the Battle of Gettysburg, fought in Pennsylvania. General Robert E. Lee, the leader of the Confederate Army, hoped to lead his troops into the North and secure a divisive victory that would force the Union to negotiate a peace treaty. This treaty could have led to a big win for the Confederacy, but things didn't go as Lee had planned. After 3 days of brutal fighting, Lee's army was beaten, and the Union soldiers, led by General George Meade, won a significant victory. However, the battle still caused huge human losses for both sides, killing and wounding over 50,000 soldiers. The outcome of this battle lessened the Confederacy's chances of winning, and the Union gained a much-needed boost in confidence. The South could no longer force the North into peace talks. The Union slowly gained the upper hand from then on, and the war shifted in their favor. But that wasn't all. Something else was happening a little to the west. The siege of Vicksburg in Mississippi became another important important turning point. Vicksburg was crucial because it was a key Confederate military base on the Mississippi River. Controlling the base meant controlling the river, which meant controlling vital supply routes and transportation. This made it a target that General Ulysses S. Grant of the Union Army really needed to capture. So he made a smart plan. First, he marched his soldiers down the west side of the Mississippi River. Then, boats moved his men across to the east side. After that, Grant and his army fought battles near Vicksburg. They won battles at Port Gibson, Raymond, and Jackson. Next, Grant's army moved closer to Vicksburg. Grant surrounded the city from the land, while Union ships blocked the river so no one on the outside could bring help by water. The Confederate soldiers were stuck inside, and being stuck inside, they couldn't really call anyone outside for help. For weeks, Grant's army stayed around the city. They dug trenches and fired cannons at the Confederates every day and night. Inside Vicksburg, food ran out. The Confederate soldiers and civilians had to eat mules, dogs, and even rats to stay alive. As a result, many got sick. On July 4th, 1863, Confederate General John C. Pemberton, seeing his men starving and exhausted with no other option, said, "We give up." He surrendered Vicksburg to General Grant, another big win for the Union Army. They now controlled the Mississippi River and split the South in two, but the war was still far from over. In 1864, General William Tecumseh Sherman, a strong and smart Union leader, wanted to really hurt the Confederate Army and make them stop fighting. He planned to march through the state of Georgia and destroy things the Confederates needed for the war. But first, he had to capture the city of Atlanta, which was very important because it had many factories, railroads, and supplies for the Confederate Army. Sherman and his soldiers moved toward the city and fought many hard battles. The Confederate soldiers tried to stop them any way possible, but Sherman's army was too strong. When Sherman's army got close to Atlanta, they surrounded the city and fired cannons at it every day. They even destroyed the railroads so no food or supplies could get in. After many weeks, the Confederate army in Atlanta became too weak to keep fighting, but things took a turn. Confederate General John Bell Hood, who led the army defending Atlanta, tried a surprise attack. If his soldiers could break through Sherman's lines, they could trap Sherman's army and force their backs against the city. All General Hood could hope for was that General Sherman's men might run out of food and bullets, forcing them to retreat or give up the fight, but Sherman had planned carefully. He sent extra soldiers to hold the line, and they stopped Hood's attack just in time. After capturing Atlanta, Sherman's forces moved forward, leaving a path of destruction across Georgia. They tore up railroads, burned homes, and destroyed factories. Sherman's tactics were harsh, but they worked. By the time he reached the city of Savannah, Sherman's army had significantly weakened the Confederate war effort. By 1865, the Union had nearly defeated the Confederacy. General Robert E. Lee, who had once seemed like the unexpected victor, now faced overwhelming Union forces. Despite his determination and the fierce resistance of his troops, the situation in the South had become impossible to win. The Confederate economy had collapsed, money was worthless, and the South's once thriving agricultural economy had been destroyed. Farms were burned, factories reduced to rubble, and cities lay in ruins. This meant that Lee, who had continued to battle despite the odds, could no longer sustain the fight. Finally, on April 9th, 1865, Lee surrendered to the Union Army at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, marking the end of the war that claimed 698,000 lives. Slaves were freed, and the Union and Confederacy were renamed the United States of America. However, rebuilding the country was estimated to cost $3.3 billion, equal to $100 billion today.